All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Lecture and Dialogue series with the Secular Dharma Foundation. We've done quite a few of these, and this is the one that I've been looking forward to for quite some time on the cult of trauma. What is that, and its negative or effects it's had on the addiction treatment industry, not just the industry, but also the recovery culture and also the individual as well. So we'll go back and forth a little bit. But first, I just want to, Alastair, I've known him for, 15 years now. We've been in contact on and off. But I just want to let him just say a few words about where he is and where he comes from before we get into the conversation. You want to give us a little bit of background, Ali?
Sure, thanks, Dave. My name's Alastair Mordey. Most of my friends call me Ali. As Dave said, we've known each other for quite a long time. I'm in Thailand, so it's morning here. I've been here for 16 years running rehabs. Previous to that, I was involved in street outreach in North London. I worked in the public sector of drug and alcohol services initially when I was in my late 20s, early 30s after getting into my own personal recovery. And then after 5, 6, 7 years of that, I relocated to Thailand and went into the private sector and ran my own treatment centers. So some fairly large treatment centers that some of you may have heard of. These days, I run a much smaller center that's much more targeted to metabolic health and a physical fitness approach to adjunct to recovery, specializing mostly with younger men. So we're quite well known at One Step Rehab in Thailand for Muay Thai with young men, triathlon training, that sort of thing, in addition to obviously your usual abstinence orientated 12-step CBT mindfulness inflected treatment program. So that's where I come from. That's what I'm doing. And Dave and I stay in regular contact. And obviously we have a lot of points of commonality with Dave's history in the mindfulness movement. So yeah, that's me. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Alistair. Ali, I always get confused.
Yeah,
Um, so anyway, let's get into it a little bit. I just want to, most of you know me. I'm Dave Smith. I'm a Dharma teacher, but I did cut my teeth in the addiction treatment world. That's where my whole career began, working with teenagers in addiction treatment programs and also juvenile detention halls. So I like to say I was trained by the best. I was trained by the self-centered, entitled American teenager. And if you can work with those folks, you can pretty much do anything. But to just kind of set the table, and I saw Ali do a video quite a while back, which kind of sparked my idea for this. I think the video is entitled "The Cult of Trauma." So I think I'm just going to let him, because he's really good at articulating this, of just kind of setting the table and giving us the backdrop for what we're going to explore this evening, and this kind of background of how trauma and addiction have become intertwined in a way. So you want to give us a little background and history on this, Ali?
sure. Yeah, so I mean, as I mentioned, I was involved in well, still am involved in running treatment centers. So I've seen this movement develop over the last 10 years, especially. Now, I used to go and give a lot of keynote addresses at addiction treatment conferences when I was running the Cabin formerly. I was one of the former owners of the Cabin, which was a very large treatment center in its heyday. So I'd be in Los Angeles, London, places like that, attending treatment center industry conferences. And I noticed a sea change towards trauma being a buzzword. Obviously everybody knows this now, but 10 years ago it was just coming into the zeitgeist. I'd say the main event that caused that was probably the publication of Gabor Mate's book, Hungry Ghosts, in 2008. And that had a big effect on the way that treatment providers saw addiction, and indeed eventually the general public, right, via YouTube and self-education platforms like that. So I noticed it. I was slightly skeptical for various reasons that we can go into. But since then, I'd say it's really gone viral. And around 2020, I felt the need to sort of say something, again, for reasons that we can go deeper into. But I wrote an article for The Spectator which went a bit viral because it was almost, I wouldn't say a taboo topic, but it was just simply something that nobody talked about. So the idea that trauma, ill-defined as I would see it, causes brain damage and indeed most addictions is something that I very much don't agree with, right? But the interesting thing was, and I can explain what I do think causes those things and why I don't think trauma does cause those things, or why trauma, as the word is used, should be defined better. But in general, the interesting thing was that one was not supposed to say that. This was not kind of acceptable. And you know me, being me, of course, that's like a red rag to a bull. So I thought, well, I'm going to say something about this. Now, I would start by saying this is not an attack on people who are suffering or indeed on trauma in general. I would contend that the original definition of PTSD covers what we would actually consider to be real trauma quite effectively already. This is my basic position, right? And therefore, one wonders why a new definition has been found. And I think there are answers for that that show conflict of interest, and not particularly good motives. All right, so that's where I came from. I saw it in the private treatment industry, to be frank, as a buzzword that was very good for marketing and got more people into treatment and kept them in treatment for longer. And my contention, as an overview, is that that is not a healthy motivation to invent a new definition of trauma, right? So, I mean, I can go into the history of how I think this started and why I think it's ill-advised in more detail, if you like, but that's kind of how I became the maverick voice on this topic, if you like.
Let me unmute my microphone. I want to just add a disclaimer now that Ali mentioned on is that, we're not here. Trauma is very real. We recognize that there has been advancements made in trauma therapy, and that people suffer with this. This is a very real thing. What we're really trying to explore and discuss tonight is the impact it's had on addiction treatment. Primarily the addiction treatment industry, that's Ali's specialty, but also recovery culture in general has been affected in a very negative way, and also the individual. So I'm going to just kind of talk a little bit about a Dharma or a Buddhist view on this. And Ali hinted to this a little bit, but I think one of the black holes that people go down, and everybody's gone down at different modalities, is trying to understand the cause of addiction as if there were a singular cause. And of course, Gabor Mate and a lot of these people, their proselytization is that the singular cause of addiction is childhood trauma, hard stop. Which I think is incorrect, and I think has created a lot of unintended consequences that have mostly been really disempowering to the people who suffer with addiction. I think it's been really disempowering, and it's really made people taken people to a level of powerless, to a level that's really been destructive to some degree. Now, so we're not looking at causality is not a really great way to think about addiction. Addiction essentially is a hijack of the entire system. It's a hijack of the cognitive, the somatic, the body, the emotional, the relational system. Addiction clearly ruins people's lives. And so trauma, like a lot of things, the way we would want to look at it more from a Buddhist perspective wouldn't be causality of trying to find the singular cause and then go in there and fix the cause and try to fix the whole thing, but to understand that things are interdependent. Another way to say that is there are contributing factors that basically put somebody in the experience of developing an addiction. It could be genetic, it could be trauma, it could be where you grew up, it could be environmental, it could be a whole number of things that may or may not actually be that helpful in unraveling the addiction. There may be some value in that, but that's kind of on a case-by-case basis. So we understand that there are contributing factors, trauma certainly being one of those. So when we try to reduce it to a singular cause, I think that we have created a lot of problems in doing so. One of the other things I think that happens, and it happens in the Dharma space, and it certainly happens in this recovery space, is what I would just simply call the rock star phenomenon. where, Gabor Mate writes this book. It does really, really well. He writes another book. He does a TED Talk. Johan Hari, who's another person in the space, does a TED Talk, goes viral. And then these guys become sort of gurus and masters, and they're like the only people who know anything about addiction all of a sudden. And this self-aggrandizement, they kind of become the only people that we become willing to listen to. And what happens is you have, 100 years of 12 steps and other modalities, what I would just generally call recovery wisdom, that, many people know a thing or two about addiction, and they know a thing or two about recovery. And a lot of that just kind of got discarded, because they found the golden gem. They found the singular cause. Now, I don't want to throw too much dirt on this, because I do understand that it's very well intentioned. When we look at addiction as a phenomenon, we're not crushing it, obviously. We've made some advancements, clearly, but we're definitely losing the war on addiction. And I understand the intentionality and the drive to wanting to find the solution, as if there were a singular solution. But what this does is it creates this thing where that finding that trauma and resolving the childhood trauma really becomes the only way. It becomes the only thing that's going to work. And then people start fishing around for stuff. And I even, as a clinician and a Dharma teacher, I even found myself kind of falling into this trap a little bit when I'm working with somebody and they're struggling with addiction. I find my mind wandering to like, oh, gee, I wonder what happened to them. Like this whole stuff has been pervasive, that we think some event in their life triggered some response where they got caught up in addiction, and we just need to go back to some kind of traumatic therapy time machine thing, and kind of like Back to the Future. We need to go back to the past. We need to rescue the person, and they won't have this problem anymore. And I think that has had more negative effect than positive effect. And I'll pass it back to Ali.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I'll pick up where you left off, Dave, and then I think take us back through how I think this developed or where it came from. So to pick up on what you said, what also concerned me, this is the central premise why this issue is of concern. Traditionally, in recovery and in addiction treatment, in institutionalized addiction treatment, the question would be, how do I live? How do I learn to live, given that I am hopelessly addicted? And then there are various answers: service, connection, being part of a fellowship, and all of that good stuff. I became concerned that through the lens, increasingly and inflexibly through the lens of trauma, the question became, what happened to you? And indeed, that's actually a meme, obviously, via Oprah Winfrey and other sort of trauma evangelists, really. That became a meme. The central question to ask people who are addicted now has become, what happened to you? And of course, that might be a legit question within a personal counseling session when you're in a treatment center, right? But in general, it wasn't the focus, it wasn't the lens through which counselors, recovering addicts themselves, sponsors and mentors in recovery helping people would ask. They would ask more the questions that are pertinent to agency. And so my concern was becoming that agency was being lost potentially, if that question, what happened to you? What happened in your childhood? Did you suffer trauma? If that is not wielded really skillfully, it can, intentionally or otherwise, be a deflection that does the recovering addict a disservice. Because as we found over 100 years of sort of 12-step tradition, right, the central question really is, what was my part? Right, so actually they are potentially mutually exclusive focus. The trauma therapy focus and the recovery focus can be, it isn't always, but it can quickly become mutually exclusive. And so that's why I was worried, because I've had 20 years of a personal and professional experience of knowing that eventually I have to get to the point of saying, now, what do you think you did here that you could do differently? Because of course we're powerless over those other people. Right, and potentially the trauma therapy questions was increasingly becoming, what did they do to you, and how can we change them? Right, that's my concern. So I started to track back and look where this came from, and it came obviously from Freud, right? And a lot of Freud's stuff is obviously extremely good, right? I mean, his exploration of the unconscious still hasn't been adequately explained. If you look at really high level philosophers and neuroscientists like Gilchrist, for example, they're still exploring that and they still haven't unraveled it. The right left brain hemispheric differences is probably what Freud was talking about, right? So Freud was brilliant, crazy, and loads of other things, right? But the bit of Freud that kicked off the trauma movement was not his best bit. That was not his finest moment. And it was the idea that one's childhood indelibly affects you. Now, that sounds so obvious to us now that we don't even question it. Well, actually, the leading minds of today question it all the time. They don't actually, I would argue that the predominant scientific view now is that that is really is not correct, right? So Freud's theory that led into what is now the trauma movement was what he literally himself called the search for hidden trauma. So this is young Freud. This is 19th century Freud that is alive and well in Gabor Mate, Bessel van der Kolk, Judith Harmon, and numerous other leading lights of the trauma therapy movement. It is pure, regurgitated, early Freud. So Freud was mentored under a guy called Joseph Breuer, who found, to his credit, the talking cure, right? So he had a young woman in treatment for with him in what they called then a sanatorium, called Bertha Pappenheim, who was diagnosed with neuroses, as women always were in those days. If there was something mental or emotional health disorder, they were almost always labeled as neurotic, right? Or suffering from hysteria. And so Joseph Breuer was trying to help her, and he found that when he sat and talked to her, that her symptoms got better. And what had sent her into treatment was the death of her father. So clearly she was grief-stricken. And he found, to his credit, that when he talked to her, her symptoms calmed down. Now, he called it the cathartic method because he thought that it was the fishing out of the traumatic material of what had happened to her that made her feel better. Now, I would already question that and say, no, I don't think so. I think we found out in the 60s, 70s, 80s with humanistic counseling what that was. That's the therapeutic alliance. The fact that a kindly person is taking an interest in you, which her family clearly weren't because they parceled her off to a hospital, right? They're taking an interest in you, and that has a calming effect on you, and you feel supported, right? So immediately we could, if we wanted to, question the cathartic method or the idea that talking about your trauma is actually what does it, right? It could be, it might not be. But anyway, Freud was massively impressed with that, and he ran off away from Breuer and started his own practice, and he started psychoanalysis, what we now know as psychoanalysis, literally analyzing your psychology, which for him was purely dogmatically and absolutely inflexibly to do with childhood trauma, which came from sexual abuse. He was very, very clear about that. And Joseph Breuer fell out with him and warned him as an older man, that is inflexible thinking. There are more causes than that. It can't possibly be that straightforward. And Freud didn't want to hear it. And he's famously inflexible. And Breuer wasn't the first person he fell out with over things like that, right? He fell out with Carl Jung as well. So Freud was a kind of quite an inflexible thinker. Probably he had a family background that had sexual abuse in it. We don't know, but that might be what was influencing his dogmaticism, right? So right from the word go, Freud thought that women in particular would become neurotic and hysterical and mentally ill, and it was because of sexual abuse, and that's it. So he was searching for traumatic material, and if they got to speak about it and got it out, then they would get better. So that essentially is where the trauma movement comes from. It went through obviously a million variations through the 20th century and was largely receding in terms of its fashionability or clinical usefulness by the 80s. And then we had a resurgence, which started with a physician called Vincent Felitti, who worked at Kaiser. So Vincent had an obesity program, and he had a Freudian theory that a lot of his clients had suffered sexual abuse in childhood and that their obesity that they couldn't get rid of, like there was this recidivist group that couldn't lose weight, and that was sort of mystifying him, and he wanted to get to the bottom of it. So he interviewed them, 280 of them, and he found that we've never seen, obviously, we haven't seen the interviews. We haven't even had a number, to the best of my knowledge, a percentage of how many of those were found to have suffered sexual abuse. But that was his theory. And so, off the back of that, he took it further, got funding, and did a very famous study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, known as the ACE study, which effectively has become the cornerstone piece of science that the trauma therapy movement is built on. Right. So, this is, to my mind, when I started to look into this, this is where it got really problematic. And I'm by no means the only person to have said this, right? There have been numerous articles on this. The ACE study tried to find 10 archetypal childhood adversities or traumas, if you like, that would make it more likely that you would have a range of conditions, and as an adult, addiction very much being one of them, but also just chronic lifestyle diseases, bronchitis, heart disease, stuff like that. And they did find a link between a higher number of adversities in childhood and poor health in adulthood, including addiction, right? So famously, those 10 areas of adversity were physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect, and then 5 areas of household dysfunction, as they called it, which were bereavement, divorced parents, a parent in prison, parent mentally ill, witnessing domestic violence. So they found that 4 or more of those things in your childhood make you much more likely to be an injecting drug user, an alcoholic, or whatever, right? Now, when I started to look at it, what I quickly found was, okay, yeah, that's true. And when you get to 6 ACEs out of 10, it climbs quite a lot more, right? So clearly there's a link. But the problem was the actual percentages of people, say, who got even 6 or more ACEs from their childhood and who, for example, injected drugs was about 8%. So while that is high, what about the other 92%? So what about the 92% of people who had relatively bad to dreadful childhoods? Why do they not use drugs? So that quickly became the obvious question, right? And then when I started to look at the survey, it was just a dreadful survey. So for example, emotional neglect, it was yes or no answers. It was not qualitative. So you could only answer yes or no. So to a question to define, for example, emotional abuse, it would be something like, I'm paraphrasing, but something like, did you ever feel when you were growing up under the age of 18 that nobody loved you? Right? That's an example of the type of questioning. So a yes to that. I mean, surely most teenagers, like ever, would, would answer yes to that, and probably quite a lot of adults who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, who are still, don't have the best of relationships with their parents or whatever, might also perhaps answer yes. So but long and short of it is, it was very subjective. It relied on recall data and lots of things that aren't very reliable. And my rather controversial, provocative piece in The Spectator was asking the question, we are a bit of a therapy generation, right? Let's be honest, not just Gen X. Everyone from baby boomers down to Gen Z, we do have more of a proclivity to hyperbolize things like that than, say, for example, the wartime generation, who, if asked, do you think your parents abused you, would probably answer no, even when they did. Or, for example, old school Asian American cultures, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, who would probably answer no, even if their parents did. So it would depend on which group you were asking that question, right? And my contention is that we live in a bit of a therapy age. We kind of tend to overdiagnose ourselves sometimes, so it wasn't very reliable. So that's where it comes from. That's what I think is the somewhat unscientific basis on which the trauma therapy movement is based. And since then, that study and hundreds of other studies that replicated it have been used, I would argue, to make pretty sweeping statements, as Gabor Mate has a tendency to do, that addiction is really mostly about what happened to you in your childhood. Now, to go back to the original point, that's not how we've operated for a long time now in terms of addiction treatment. We've operated on the basis that we come from all sorts of different backgrounds, right? It's patently obvious that that's the case. If you go to any 12-step meeting, you'll meet people who come from dreadful backgrounds, and you'll meet people who had idyllic childhoods. And most of us will be somewhere in between, right? And further, we found that we do not need to psychoanalyze ourselves. This has never been part of our movement, right? We have always had started from the position of I drink, I use drugs. It's not working for me. I need to find a way to live. And pretty quickly, our fellows come in and say, okay, what you're going to need to do is some personal house cleaning. You may have had a difficult childhood, but which parts of that are you replicating as an adult? And you could stop doing that, right? So the agency is very much on the individual in most traditional recovery movements. And with this trauma therapy movement, right from the get-go, right from its inception and its conceptualization, the idea was, no, you're a victim, essentially, was the message that it was giving people. And that's where I took exception with it and started to dissect it and look at how scientifically plausible it was. Not very, in my view, not very. And here's how I'd conclude it. Is it not pretty obvious that we are the least traumatized generation that has ever lived on planet Earth? That should be fairly obvious. Okay, if you look at the ancestral environment, if you look at the Dark Ages, the medieval period, even the Victorian era, I would suggest that childhood trauma was rather more pronounced during each of those periods. Now, I suppose you could make the argument that we are more atomized, right? We have less support. You might be able to make an argument like that. But in which case, then, we're talking about something different. We're talking about the fact that we are less supported. We feel more traumatized. Right now, I'm open to that kind of debate, that we're more atomized, we have less community, we have less potent belief systems to support us and protect us from anything that might be an adversity. And we are therefore, hate to use this word, but weaker, less resilient psychologically than we were. That idea, I think, has some legs. But the idea that we have suffered more traumas than previous generations and have a sudden spike in trauma that's causing all of our ailments, I think is not credible, right? And so, of course, you went through a period in the 2010s, especially, where mass media you would frequently see headlines like childhood trauma causes migraines, childhood trauma causes liver disease, childhood trauma causes brain damage. And I think these claims are not credible. And it's more to do really with what is essentially an activist movement at large in mental health. Yeah, which has to do with grievance politics and is about, but whether it intends to or not, and I don't think it does. I think Vincent Felitti, for example, was a very well-meaning doctor. He was a public health official who saw a lot of health inequalities. You know, he saw a lot of people from poorer communities suffering more lifestyle diseases that were killing them more, and he decided to try and find out why and do something about it. And I think even he, though, would concede now that it's gone a little too far. Right, and that childhood trauma of the type that they are describing is not powerful enough to cause brain damage because most of the traumas that they're describing are normal, everyday adversities. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a lot to chew on. I'm gonna create a hinge in the conversation here a little bit and offer a couple of stories that I experienced through this, and then also what I would call an alternative path that really kind of masks the path that has been mostly helpful through the 12 steps. And that really is about empowerment and redemption and taking responsibility and lifting the person up and really trying to stay away from this victimhood mentality. And also the one thing that nobody really wants to point to and to just kind of get into the grittiness of this is that this whole getting sober addiction thing is all about confrontation. It's very, very confrontational. And what we've done is we've given the addict a kind of a side conversation to have that allows them to avoid the fact that they're taking behaviors and choosing to engage in behaviors that they could have some agency over. Now, just personally, I have been diagnosed, and I think it's an accurate diagnosis, with complex PTSD. And I didn't actually seek trauma therapy till I was in my mid 30s. I was 15 years sober. I was a Dharma teacher. I was a meditator. I'd sat at retreats. I'd gone through all this healing, all this work, never did one iota of trauma therapy. And so I was sitting with my symptoms were very much of a hypervigilance. I had a really, really strong hypervigilance. And all through the 90s, I was sitting 10-day Vipassana retreats. I was really able to embody my experience. I was able to function really, really well in spite of these traumatic stress symptoms. And then I got sober in 2003. And really the 12 steps is what allowed me to do that. So I really had a Dharma practice, a meditation practice. And really, I think the simplest way to define the 12 steps is cognitive behavioral therapy. You act your way into right thinking. And there's tremendous benefits of doing that, especially if you have help from other people. But I had the benefit of kind of coming into this space. It was interesting in maybe 2010, I started working in addiction treatment, and all of a sudden mindfulness was everywhere. And I had this huge Buddhist background in mindfulness. And then trauma kind of came onto the scene, as Ali pointed out very well. And I started to see really sort of a lot of bad things happen. One of the things that happened is if you had an addiction treatment center, and I lived in Nashville, Tennessee, there were tons of them, where it's like if you didn't have the word trauma on your website, you were going to go out of business. So it became very much a marketing thing. And it became very much about trying to heal this childhood trauma. Now, I was in clinical meetings where you'd have, there's some real grit here. You have a girl who came into an addiction treatment center with an eating disorder, substance abuse, who was, serially, raped by her father and her father's friends for years and years and years. Massive, massive sexual trauma, terrible background. Of course, drug addiction would make a lot of sense with that background. But then you find yourself in a clinical meeting and of course this is all good, but a woman who's the therapist at the treatment center, who just graduated from college, who grew up in Nashville, who grew up in a very idyllic childhood, never saw anything bad happen, is, halfway through her EMDR training. And she's sitting in the room with this girl who's been sexually abused, doesn't know a thing about it, doesn't know what's going on, and is asking her to bring up her most challenging experience, and is trying to do the EMDR therapy. And I saw this happen many, many times, and people just went sideways. They were just throwing the intervention at it. The people were poorly trained. The therapists who don't have addiction background just hear the stories of the things people go through, and they can't really barely handle it. So you saw a lot of this inability to really navigate the space where, the therapists and the people at the treatment centers were getting the secondary trauma. And by focusing on the trauma, it kind of took all of the other treatment protocol, it kind of deteriorated in a way that I was like, I think we're hurting these people. I think we're hurting these people. And so what I want to kind of get into now is, what is actually the traumatic state, PTSD? What is that? What's really going on in the individual? Now, I've explored this personally on myself. I have a really lot of insight into this. And so what addiction is, it's a system hijack. Largely the hijack is through the emotional system. Now, I'll get on my soapbox for a minute because I think this is fascinating and tragic. Dan Goleman, who I grew up down the street from, wrote the book Emotional Intelligence in 1995. It was on the New York's bestsellers for years and years and years. And as much as mindfulness made its way into the addiction treatment world, the emotional intelligence movement really didn't make its way into that world. And I think that was a tragic loss, because when you are in the stress, let's just talk about stress, the traumatic stress, whether it's traumatic stress or regular stress, what you are feeling, the pressure you are feeling in that moment is actually emotion. It's the emotional hijack, the emotional explosion, or the emotional repression. And if you look at the science and the research, and even Gabor Mate would probably actually say this, what people engage in addictive behaviors as a self-regulation strategy, it's actually about emotion regulation. drinking alcohol, taking opioids, whatever the behavior is, it regulates the emotion. And as individuals, we have to do that. We have to regulate the emotion. And we will regulate the emotion. We'll do whatever we have to do. You damn well better believe we're going to do what we have to do to regulate that state. So we're talking about emotion. We're talking about emotional stress. And when you look at the science of emotion, we've also gotten to this really bad habit that goes to the trauma thing of trying to manage triggers. Like, we really got to get out of the business of trigger management because anything can trigger an emotional experience. In fact, the definition of emotion, the simple definition of emotion is emotions arise anytime we sense something important to my welfare is occurring. Something important to my welfare is occurring. I don't feel safe. Rightly or wrongly, I might feel like I know there's not a tiger on the other side of that door, but maybe I feel like there is. Then that emotion arises in that experience in less than 1/32 of a second. And if I have no skills or no abilities on how to regulate that emotional experience, then I'm going to reach for whatever I've done in the past that has been successful, which is why people have such a hard time getting clean and getting sober. And so when you break down the model of emotion, it's really simple. There's a trigger. Something triggers the emotion to arise, which can literally be anything. I'll give you another personal example I've given many times. When I was younger, I was sexually molested by the paper boy. And he used to come to my grandmother's house, and he had his bags of newspapers. Well, I don't know if you noticed, but newspapers have a very strong smell. And for years and years and years, anytime I would smell a newspaper, I would get filled with a murderous rage. No idea why. All it took was that smell of that newspaper to trigger that experience, right? Now, did I have to go back and do a bunch of EMDR on the sexual abuse with the paper boy? No, I didn't have to do that. And I didn't do that. What I needed to do was be able to regulate that emotional state. So there's a trigger, there's an experience, and there's a response. Now, the real work that we try to do, this is why going to treatment and not doing this IOP sober living shit, going somewhere far away where you can be isolated, you have to learn how to regulate the experience of the emotion, of the difficult emotion. You have to be able to see it come, you have to be able to see it go, and you have to be able to understand from a self-efficacy point of view that you can see it come and you can see it go, and it will self-liberate. You don't actually have to you don't have to drink. You have to get some wins under your belt. So there's a trigger, there's an experience, and there's a response. There's something that we do. And if I can't regulate the state, then I'm not going to be able to choose the outcome. If I can't regulate the state, I'm going to do whatever the addiction behavior is. And that's that cycle that we get in. And we miss this signal around emotion. And so, and this was my case, this is true for me. So, I have this experience. Within the emotional regulation system or within the emotional intelligence movement, if I can learn how to regulate the state, the traumatic state, the trauma becomes irrelevant or it becomes secondary. It's because now I've been able to regulate whether it's anger, fear, sadness, contempt, disgust, shame. It doesn't really matter what the emotion is. If I can regulate that emotional experience, I can kind of move through life. I can get some wins under my belt. I can get 90 days. I can live in this world. I can live life on life's terms in a way. Does that mean it's easy? No, it's not easy. It's really, really hard. It's really, really challenging. We fuck up all the time. It's really, really messy. But this is the stress. This is the biological experience. So from the point of view of emotional intelligence, recovery, all recovery is a moment by moment skill. It's a moment by moment skill. And addiction is the system hijack. And what happens is that trigger, that experience happens. We get flooded by that emotional experience and we're able to regulate that. And there's really three things that we have to be able to do. And if you can do this, man, I'll tell you, you're kind of going to become invincible. Is that we have to have emotional awareness. That means I need to know when I've become emotional. It might be helpful to know what emotion is. It might be helpful to know I'm super angry right now. I'm full of shame right now. Being able to define the emotion may or may not have value, and it's good to psychoeducation. When you go into treatment, you should learn about this stuff. So I need to be able to recognize and know when I've become emotional. And then in that moment, that skill of what I need to do is I need to be able to emotionally regulate that experience. That might be doing a body scan. It might be doing mindfulness of breathing. It might be listening to the birds in the background. There's 1,000 different methodologies for this shit. It's not actually that, it's really not that complicated. It's really not that profound. But I have to have that awareness. I basically I have to kind of install a check engine light on my system that kind of comes online and says, whoa, 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 like, you need to be careful right now. Because if there's emotional awareness and there's emotional regulation, then what you get is choice. And that's really, in fact, in the 70s, or even in the 80s, one of the ways addiction was defined was as an absence of choice. That was one of the criteria, is I no longer had a choice as to whether I drank or used. The choice has been, it's gone. I don't have it anymore. So when we get that choice back, the freedom of that choice comes back. We get that agency back. Even in small little bits and increments, that's really the empowering part of the process. Now, all of this can be done, all of this can be developed without saying the T word one time at all, right? We don't necessarily have to go back and dig up all the dead bodies, right? Now, also, I'll go so far as to say there are, in the broader sense, there are different trauma therapies that have been effective. Parts work, somatic experiencing, EMDR, but they all should come with a warning label on the bottle. Okay? Because they go back to the story with the girl. So you have a 23-year-old girl who's been clean for 5 days. She's basically a total mess. She's been clean for 5 days. She's removed from her environment where she's using. She's sitting in some office in some building in Nashville somewhere. Do you think on day 5 is a good time to bring up the fact that she was raped by her father and all his friends for years and years? Do you really think that's the conversation to be having? And so what happens is a lot of times is there is this kind of religion around that. The first thing that needs to happen in the addiction treatment protocol is the trauma needs to be addressed. And that's just simply not true. Like I said, I didn't deal with it till 15 years after I was sober. And so they kind of cram this down people's throats. And I saw a lot of people leave treatment because of these kinds of things, being like, I didn't sign up for this shit. I came here to get sober. Why are we talking about this stuff? Like, I'm a mess right now. I still have post-acute withdrawal symptoms. I'm still shaking. I still want to get high wicked bad. Why the fuck am I talking to this 23-year-old girl about the horrible shit that my dad did to me? Like, why the fuck are we having this conversation? And I saw this happen time and time and time again, to the point where I just stopped working there. I just I can't even be in this space. It's borderline, or I wouldn't even say borderline. A lot of it is just simply unethical. And I'll go so far as to say, and I got this working with teenagers. I learned this from the American Teenager. If I had a treatment center, if you're working in addiction and you don't have a personal experience with addiction, I think you have no business working. Find something else to do. Because especially with teenagers, the first thing they would ask the clinician or the group person or the facilitator at the treatment center, they would say, are you in recovery? And if the person said no, the kids would immediately just dismiss you of having anything to say that was useful. They're like, you don't understand. And I'll even dip into the spiritual realm a little bit. This is what Bill and Dr. Bob discovered a long time ago. The therapeutic value of one drug addict talking to another drug addict. Somebody who can sit down and go, me too, I did that too. I've been through that experience. I can resonate. I've been there too. And I don't live like that anymore. The therapeutic value of that. And like it or not, and I don't particularly like this, but what seems to be the case for people who get into recovery and are able to maintain long-term recovery, they have what we simply could call, they have to have what we would call something like a religious experience. We could call it a moment of clarity. You could call it a spiritual awakening. You could call it a come to Jesus moment. You can call it, there's 1,000 words that we could call it. But people need to have a tremendous change of feeling and outlook. And in the Dharma world, we would call that a Dharma transmission. And that is this basic understanding that there has to be another way for me to live in this world. There just has to be another way for me to live in this world. And once people touch into that experience, then they can embark on a recovery process that may or may not touch or scratch or even mention the traumatic experience. So within this cult of trauma, they've almost become obsessed with untangling and unraveling what happened to you rather than what do you want to do now. And that shift, I think it's swinging back a little bit the other way. But this seems to be where we are. And I'll let Ali take it back.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I'm glad you picked up on that. So this is exactly why I started questioning it. Obviously, working in private treatment, what I started to see a lot was what we called it open heart surgery, or doing open heart surgery without enough time to stitch somebody back up together again. And of course, when you introduce a viral concept like trauma, you have trauma, we can heal it through nervous system therapies and so on. Come to our treatment center. Oh, you can only do 1 month. Never mind, we can still do it for you, but they can't. They can't possibly. How could they? It's too involved. So we used to do what's called sequential treatment. And then the trend with trauma and addiction, the addiction would be treated first, and the trauma would be treated ongoingly. So even 12-step groups like AA have always been very clear and open to the idea that some people have significant trauma, obviously, and I'd agree, specifically eating disorders have a higher incidence of childhood sexual trauma for sure. That's at least what I've seen, right? And groups like AA have always been open to this, and the kind of wisdom was always, look, you get sober so you're not using and drinking and getting yourself into chaotic, dangerous situations, and then work long term on the childhood issues, which are quite severe, with a psychotherapist. That's what we'd call sequential treatment. Lock down the sobriety so you're safe, and then work long term in a correct environment, with the correct protocols in place over the time period that's necessary to do the work correctly. But of course, with the commercial imperative, trauma sells. People will come to my rehab if I talk about trauma. It pretty quickly becomes a bit of a mess because treatment centers start over promising and under delivering and promising people that they can heal their trauma in a month, when of course they can't do any such thing. So that is entirely the reason why I started to question this. And I'm also glad you brought up complex PTSD. I'll bring that in to explain how I think it could be part of that problem, actually. Originally, we had PTSD in 1980, came after the Vietnam War. The DSM-3 was very clear because they had a lot of shell-shocked veterans. They knew this was a distinct illness. This wasn't psychosis, it wasn't depression, it wasn't anxiety. It was their brains had been damaged by being shelled in muddy ditches. They have their amygdala and hippocampi had shrunk or enlarged or whatever. I'm not a neurologist, so I don't know the exact organ etiology of this, if that is the right word. But their brains could easily be damaged. So we had the PTSD definition, which said this will be caused by discrete events of terror where actual or threatened death is extremely likely, and that is outside the realm of ordinary human experience, but that would distress almost anybody. Right, so those are the types of traumas that mangle your brain and cause brain damage, and of course your nervous system damage. Now, do lesser hurts or lesser upsets or lesser adversities in life that are lower than that, but still profoundly debilitating to your ability to not be angry with everyone in your life and form proper relationships because you had a mother who was mentally ill, who emotionally abused you. Of course, those also have a legacy, right? And those are the things that complex trauma, as far as I can see, was designed to address. These are a list of childhood adversities that have affected your development, right? But what has ended up happening is treatment centers and counseling centers have evolved a method of care called trauma-informed care based around complex PTSD, where things like saying, my name's Ali, I'm an addict, is disavowed because addict is a negative word and it's not your fault and they did it to you. So, which both could be true, right? You could have had bad things done to you, and you can still voluntarily label yourself an addict, because, of course, as recovering addicts, right, we know the reason we use that is we've reappropriated the word. We're not using it in a negative sense. We're using it in an empowering sense. But to your point, Dave, when you've got people who aren't in recovery, but who are terribly well educated around trauma, who come in well-meaning into the field and say, you guys have got to stop shaming yourselves by calling yourselves addicts. Well, that isn't why we're doing it, right? We're doing it to remind ourselves that there is actually a part of us, unfortunately, that's involved in creating this addiction. That's called our hindbrain. It's a monster. It's 100 million years old. It has hijacked our prefrontal cortex. We can't control our addictive behavior. And when we say, my name's Ali, I'm an addict, I'm reminding myself that my reptilian brain is in control when I'm smoking crack. It's not my human brain isn't anywhere in the picture. That's why we call ourselves addicts and gather in a circle and get honest with each other. And thanks very much, but we'll decide whether we're labeling ourselves or not. So that's the type of well-meaning mistake that has crept in through this hyperbole around trauma, right? And to end, I suppose, on your point of the emotional treatment, emotional sobriety really is what what you specialize in, Dave. So I've just said, I suppose, treatment centers should stop trying to pretend they can fix people and do open heart surgery when they can't. And that comes down to a irresponsible diagnosis, right? And I think there's a problem there with the way we talk about trauma. Then we have established the fact that maybe you need chemical sobriety first, right, before you can get emotional sobriety. And this well-meaning but extremely inaccurate, and to be honest, slightly politicized concept of trauma is not helpful in that. It can without meaning to, persuade people that perhaps they're not an addict, perhaps that's not their problem, perhaps it's not their hijacked brain that's really the problem. It's what's going on around them, right? So if you can't get chemical sobriety, then anything that interferes with that is dangerous to my mind, because you won't then get the emotional sobriety. And then to your point of emotional sobriety, we have many systems that go back for thousands of years. The most recent one that's very, very good is the 12-step model. We've got Buddhism, we've got yoga, we've got meditation, we've got our own native traditions, whichever culture you're from, you have your ancient traditions of how to format yourself and how to live strongly. Essentially, the treatment for addiction, as you know, is having a spiritual dimension to your life, whatever that means. Now, for some people, that can be quite prosaic at first. It might just be opening up to other people or sitting in a circle and talking about stuff you haven't felt comfortable talking about. And then it can grow in any number of directions. And there are any number of ways of living that are very potent at healing, even, I would say, the most pronounced trauma. So the 12-step rooms, just to pick one example, never mind Buddhist monasteries, never mind Christian monasteries, never mind other places, is full of traumatized vets who aren't smoking crack anymore, right? And whose emotional sobriety is improving slowly over the years. Now, of course, will they receive extra counseling on the side, go to see a psychologist once a week and so on? And will they there practice somatic experiencing or so on? Yes, that would be good. But don't forget, yoga is also a form of somatic experiencing. As is meditation. And then we have a number of other new sort of modalities like ice baths and things. And the way that they work, obviously, is to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, which was overstimulated during trauma or highly stressful environments. The way I would define what a lot of psychologists today call childhood trauma, I would call it inescapable stress experienced in childhood. So obviously, when you're a child, you can't escape your stressors. Right. So that's what we used to call it. We used to call it inescapable stress. I think that's what they're talking about. And of course, that wears down your nervous system. That wears down you. You become distorted. Your personality gets distorted. And so in recovery, you need to undistort your personality, right? And there are a range of ways to do that. And one really odd one that most people wouldn't think of would be service. altruistically forgetting about your own, saying, right, I'm 2 weeks in the rooms, I'm 2 weeks clean and sober. I'm completely messed up and distorted. My personality's all over the place. Why wouldn't it be? Because I grew up in that environment and then I used drugs for a number of years on the street. You can't possibly do that and remain undistorted. You have to become distorted to live with the illness, right? To keep doing the things that you do as an addict. I'd argue a lot of the trauma that addicted people have, they picked up through their using because of the chaos that they were exposed to, right? And that's the other bit that doesn't get spoken about. So to undistort that, now I'm 2 weeks clean and sober, what do I do? Well, there's another guy just walked in the room who's even more messed up than me. Why don't I go and work with him and help him, make him a cup of tea, take him to the next meeting? And we've always had this kind of received wisdom handed down to us in recovery that when everything else fails, altruistic behavior and service work will succeed and it will medicate you. And there'll be a neuroscientific reason, a neurochemical reason for that we don't currently understand, right? But we don't need to because we've experienced it so many times over and over again, so many of us, right? So to your point on emotional sobriety, Dave, yeah, I absolutely agree. That is where it comes to quite quickly after chemical sobriety. But the techniques that are able to provide emotional sobriety, serenity, we'd call it in recovery, right? Which is what everyone's looking for. When you have serenity, the serenity and the legacy of your childhood trauma are mutually exclusive. They can't exist together, right? So when you start to develop decent chunks of serenity, those things will, as you said, not become irrelevant. They still happened, but they don't exert the same power over you. But the techniques and ways of finding that are absolutely not the sole preserve of trauma therapists, as if they're the Johnny come latelys. The answers to these things exist in all of our traditions, and most especially in things like meditation and yoga, and even you might say things that you see people spontaneously discovering now, like wild swimming, long distance running, out on a trail running, things like that. All of those things are body-based therapies. They all heal your nervous system if they're done with the right mindset and for the right reasons, right? So, yeah, that's just the last bit I wanted to say, really, following on from your points. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And we're going to open it up in just a few minutes, or just a couple last reflections. Is that the impact of this that has on the treatment industry is this hyper focus on the trauma and really an abandoning of other modalities that have just stood the test of time. And then in the recovery culture, it's really created this, again, this sense of confusion and this sense of dismissing that which has come before, which we've known. There is this traditional recovery wisdom that has kind of got swept by the wayside, which really just leaves, I find, leaves the individual just totally fucking confused. Doesn't know what to do and really has kind of confused things to the point where it's really people, they don't trust where to go. They're not sure where to go. And it creates that kind of freeze experience. So I'm going to stop the recording here.